That's a good question. First of all, no, it's not what I knew I wanted to do. I I was interested in English literature as a high school student, and I was also interested in art. And it was back when we didn't have AP art history classes, so nobody taught art history at all. So I didn't know anything about it, and my mom took me to museums. I grew up in New
Mhm,
Jersey, so she took me to museums in New York and to dance events in New
mhm,
York, and that's how I got my early exposure to art, and I loved it. But she also, from the time I was very young, noticed that I was excited in doing art, and so I took a lot of classes, and she encouraged me, and my dad encouraged me in high school, and I realized I was pretty good at it.
mhm,
And uh, I thought about going to art school, but then I decided that I wanted to be in a liberal arts
mm,
environment because I didn't want to just study art. And so I went to Oberlin and started out as an English major. And then as part of my distribution requirements, took the first part of the art history survey and
mhm.
just sort of realized how much I loved it. Um, and I really, it was really from there. So freshman year in college, I went to Oberlin, which is a really art and music and
Yeah,
theater centered
yeah.
place. And it was an incredible place to be. And I just fell in love with art history. And then it went on from there. So then I did a study abroad semester in Florence, Italy, and I
Wow.
loved it even more because I realized, oh, art history allows me to travel. And then,
Yeah.
I took, I guess my senior year, I had forgotten this until recently. I had taken a class on curatorial studies.
Mm,
And I really didn't know much about it. And it was a very historically based class, and I actually found a paper that I wrote for it recently when I was
oh,
cleaning some
wow.
stuff out. And I was like, oh, I was like really involved in this. I was like doing research on objects in the
Wow.
collection. And
Mhm.
but when I graduated, it was back in the days when people went to college, and they weren't all pre-professional. People were
Mhm.
much more uh, many more people were going for like broad educations, and especially from Oberlin. And
Yeah.
I moved to Boston with a whole bunch of friends, and I started working as a youth outreach worker for some community school program. And it was essentially working with high risk students, some of whom were in gangs and things like that, and trying to help them shift what they were doing with like
Mhm.
productive programming and that sort of thing. And I really liked it, but at the same time, I really wanted to try working in a museum.
Mhm.
And it was before the internet, and we had to like look for ads every day in the newspaper, and for open jobs in the classified section. And then, nothing was instant. So you'd circle whatever you thought, and then you'd
Oh,
write formal letters that you'd type up
oh,
and
wow.
mail out, and then you'd wait for a call. And I got a call back about part-time evening and weekend gallery supervisor at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. And it was essentially the job that no one wanted because it was part-time and it was evening and weekends. So all the
Oh,
times that most people don't want to be working,
yeah.
but I took it in addition to the full-time job that I already
Mhm.
had because I figured it was a foot in the door. And eventually I got offered a full-time job as the gallery manager. So it was managing all of the gallery guards, and I
Mhm.
guess we would call them visitor assistants now, and
Mhm.
then the store. And that was a full-time job. So I left the other job behind, and
Mhm.
then was really bored with it because it was mostly an administrative and business
Yeah.
kind of job. And I
Mhm.
was more interested in the content. So
Yeah.
when the curatorial assistant position opened up, I got offered the job, and then I went and I worked as a curatorial assistant for a couple of years with two people, Matthew Teitelbaum and Elizabeth Sussman, who at the time I didn't realize were such important curators. And I got trained under them. And then eventually, Elizabeth left for the Whitney Museum, and I left, and then Matthew left to become chief curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And so then there was a recession, and in the like 93, no, 92, I think, um, 91, somewhere around then. And I got another job because I got laid off from my job at the ICA.
Mhm.
They laid off like more than a third of their staff. And I got a job as what was it called? I guess it was like an arts coordinator for a big public works project that was happening in Boston. And there was an allocated amount of
Mhm.
government funds for to do art programs and art projects. And that too was like a very bureaucratic job. And
Mm.
I decided that since there was a recession, and there was an opportunity to go to grad school, that would make a lot of sense, because I realized while I was at the ICA, that without an advanced degree, I wasn't going to be able to progress and be a curator. So
Mm.
I really decided that I wanted to be a curator through that process. And then once I realized that I needed to get a further degree, I decided to get the master's and the PhD so that I would become a subject expert, but also so that I could set myself apart from other people who were going for curatorial jobs. When I was in undergrad, I was studying more medieval and Renaissance art, and part
Oh,
of that
okay.
had to do with the professors who were there.
Mhm.
Part of it had to do with the professor who I really wanted to study with had been on sabbatical. And so the timing in modern and contemporary didn't exactly line up while I was there. I took a modern art class,
Mhm.
and I took women in modern art class, and she was a
Ooh.
feminist, and she was doing a lot of early work on feminism and art
Mhm.
history in the
Mhm.
80s, which was really early for that.
Yeah.
And I just became fascinated with all of that material. And then when I got to the ICA, I realized that I just didn't know so much, and I loved it. I loved working with living artists, but I also knew that I really had to have a strong grounding in modernism,
Mhm.
in particular. Uh, and and then I decided to do contemporary because I that's what I really was interested in, and I was interested in becoming a contemporary curator. Thank you. there's so many things. There's so many skills that are important to being a curator.
Hmm.
And, you can be different kinds of curators. So they're independent
Hmm.
curators. They're not associated with an institution. So they may work on
Okay.
a project basis. I've done that sometimes, but
Hmm.
most of my experience has been working in a large institution or in several large institutions. So I'll speak to it from that perspective. And um, you also can work with a permanent collection of
Hmm.
objects, or you can be a curator in an institution that doesn't collect. So, I built the ICA here,
Yeah.
and there's no collection. So you organize
Yeah.
exhibitions, but then you borrow works from
Hmm.
individuals and other museums, and that's very different from working in an institution with a collection, because if you work in an institution with a collection, you have multiple different responsibilities.
Hmm.
You're in charge of the
Hmm.
collection and in the well-being of the collection,
Hmm.
and in the growth of the collection. Sort of, you develop collection plans, and that's sensible for what you can do with budgets and fundraising, et cetera, what already exists in the collection, what are the holes in the collection, what are things in the collection that need to be let go of, either because of poor quality or damage or duplication. That's called
Hmm.
deaccessioning. Um, and working with the conservators who take care of the artwork physically and
Hmm.
repair it, or and also the registrars who keep track of the work. So, like, from the minute something is going to come into a museum, and all of its movements around the museum, the registrars keep track of it and keep track of its condition and make sure that everything's okay with it. So you deal with that
Hmm.
on the one hand,
Hmm.
and with exhibitions on the other. And for exhibitions, there's a lot of research that goes into it, like academic research.
Hmm.
And that's where a lot of my training comes in handy, because knowing the history of art, you can come up with ideas for exhibitions, but it also helps inform new kinds of exhibitions for contemporary art, when you're thinking about different themes or historical moments, etc. So um, you also work with donors to try
Hmm.
to raise money. Um, you install the galleries and you decide what works are going to be in the galleries, how it's going to be installed, and you work with uh, exhibition designers for that. You work with lighting designers, art handlers, and preparators. So you really, as a
Hmm.
curator, are working with a huge team of people in order to do your work. The other side of it is you're working with the fundraising department. You're to raise money for exhibitions. You may, be meeting with corporations,
Hmm.
telling them about the exhibition for sponsorships with, high net worth individuals who are able to give money to it. So donor cultivation is a big
Hmm.
part of the responsibility. And I think it really depends where you are, because
Hmm.
in some museums, um, my graduate advisor, actually, who is now curator at the National Gallery, he doesn't do fundraising at all. He really sticks to his
Oh.
material. So it
Hmm.
depends where you are, what the size of the institution is, what the budget is. It
Hmm.
depends on a lot of factors. Um, but I also work with the communications department. So
Hmm.
dealing with public relations and marketing, and helping, write synopses of exhibitions that they can use in press releases, that the development office can use in grant applications, etc. So, you're really working in a lot of different capacities. And what I could say about being a curator is you never have the same day twice. That's Dash.
Hmm.
Um, you never have the same day twice. So If you're someone who just likes constantly, new things and being challenged and having lots of different things thrown at you, it's a really great job. It also involves, if you're doing your job right, it involves travel, and it means, going to art fairs, going to see important exhibitions in different places, going to conferences for networking so that, you have a whole set of colleagues that, you can, work with if you need objects from their collection, or if they have ideas, to play off of, or going to the Venice Biennale, for example, it's sort of a mini art world reunion. You go and you see tons of people, curators and directors and artists and gallerists and journalists. And so all of those things are important for cultivating awareness about your program and what you're doing at your museum.
Mhm.
And it really broadens your experience. And I was just talking about this with my undergraduates last week, and it's not like you know how to do that automatically. Like, I never took a museum studies class. Well, I took one in college and I had forgotten I'd taken it, but I took one museum studies class my senior year of college. But in graduate school, I didn't take any. I only studied art history and theory. And so, you know, it's the kind of thing that you figure out as you go along. But I would also say now the thing I tell my students is that
Mhm.
it's always been very competitive, to
Mhm.
get a curatorial position
Mhm.
at a museum in the United States. It's like academia and getting a professorship
Oh, wow.
where you sort of have to go where the jobs are, and you don't have the
Mhm.
opportunity in most cases to pick and
Mhm.
choose.
Mm.
So, you know, you you have to sort of figure out what you want out of your life and what are the most important things and work your way back. So if it's really important for you to live where your family lives, like, I'd say maybe think about a different career, because you don't know where you're
Mhm.
going to wind up. You can't just be like, I love Richmond, my family's here, and I'm going to get a job at the VMFA, because there are a handful of jobs, and it's very competitive
Mhm.
nationally and internationally. So you can't do that. Um, the other thing that I tell my students is nowadays, I think it's really important to do internships,
Mhm.
and to keep doing them throughout school and do them in different areas. Like, if you think that you want to be a curator, see if you can get one in a curatorial department. But if not, go work in the development department of a museum, or go work in the library, or whatever. Wherever you are, you'll start to learn about how museum functions and operates, and learn about the different components. And you're going to gather experience that you can put on your resume, so that when
Mhm.
you graduate, you don't just have, like, I was a server at Cracker Barrel, which is all well and good, but it doesn't tell your future employer, like, what you're going to bring to the table, other
Yeah.
than, you showed up at work, you were pleasant, you were responsible, you know what I mean? So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think those things matter. Um, and the other thing I said to them is that it you don't know how to do these, even if you do take museum studies classes. And,
Mhm.
I teach in an art history and a museum studies program at VCU.
Mhm.
Um, reading about it and doing it are two entirely different
Different
things.
things. Yes.
And I still believe that it's good, I guess, to take those museum studies classes. I'm still not, uh, I still don't think it's enough if you want to be a curator just to take museum studies classes. Maybe if you just want to work in a museum in another area, it's
Mhm.
fine. But, I think if you want to be a curator, you either have to go into an MA program that is specifically about curating. But most places now want curators to get their PhD.
Mm.
So it's gotten much more competitive since
Yeah.
I went into grad school in the early 90s in terms of what the expected terminal degree was. And, um, you know, still, even when you do those programs, you know, it's so different from going in and working in a curatorial department and, figuring out what's involved in organizing an exhibition, what is a checklist,
Hmm.
what is a loan form, loan letters to potential donors, just all of the different things, managing a budget, figuring out how
Hmm.
to put a budget together. It's very, that is one thing that you learn on the ground. The other thing
Hmm.
is, making connections, and networking is absolutely essential. So, getting to know galleries in different places that sell artwork, getting to know the people who run the galleries, getting to know what artists they represent, going to see shows, in addition to knowing the curators and directors, it's really important to develop that as well, because you have to keep up with what's going on and
Yeah.
the kind of work that people are doing, emerging artists who are just starting to bubble up to the surface,
Hmm.
ones who are in grad school and are showing a lot of promise, um, and then artists who are already kind of out there mid-career, and then really established artists, So
Yeah.
it's a kind of job where you are always learning. You can
Hmm.
never stop learning. And so I always compare it, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way,
Hmm.
but I always compare it to like being an accountant, or a customer service
Hmm.
representative, where, you know, you learn what you have to do, and then it's pretty much the same
Yeah.
thing over and over and over again. And that is not the kind of career this is. And that was very important to me because um, it is something you mentioned at the beginning that I'm passionate about. I love
Yeah.
art. I love this kind of work. And so for me, the expansiveness of it is just thrilling. There's always a new book.
Yeah.
There's always more artists. There are always more exhibitions and places to travel to, experiences to have, new people to meet. And so I really view it as a way of life, as
Hmm.
opposed to like a job that I would go to and come home from. It's
Yeah.
just my personal life and my professional life overlap. So like if Mr. Coleman and I are going somewhere on vacation, we go to museums, or I'm like, I
Hmm.
have to see the Agnes Martin show. And then,
Hmm.
he's learned the whole time I've been learning. So he's really into it as well. So, it's like, is that work? Is that pleasure? Well, it's
Hmm.
both, right? And
Hmm.
and I'm just really fortunate that the career that I've chosen allows me to combine those things in my life. Another thing is you, I explained sort of in the museum,
Hmm.
how you work. I mean, always there for an
Yeah.
exhibition, for example, there's always an exhibition team with
Hmm.
people from all over the museum who, are assigned to it. And then you work together in
Hmm.
order to make it happen, and everyone brings their specialty into play. When you move beyond the museum, you can work with consultants as part of a team. So, for
Hmm.
example, if certain projects have to be done that um, you're not qualified to do, like develop a new website for the museum, right? So we
Hmm.
hired someone when I was in Indianapolis. We hired a team from Chicago, and then we worked with them in terms of developing content, in terms of giving feedback on the design and how it functioned.
Hmm.
Um, I've worked very closely with the best arts and culture communications firm in the United States. called Resnicow and Company and Resnicow and Associates, and
Mhm.
um, they do work on PR, social media. They have relationships with journalists in arts and culture all over the United States and in some cases the world. Um, and I've worked with them very closely on different projects that I've worked
Mhm.
on. So when I was the US Commissioner for the Venice Biennale, I
Mhm.
worked with them just constantly on meeting with press over several years to
Mhm.
talk to them about what the project was, how it was developing, giving them updates, going to New York. I did that for the opening of the ICA. So over
Mhm.
several years, I worked with them to do the same thing, meet people in Washington, meet people in New York City, here. So those are just a couple of examples. When I did the 100-acre sculpture park, um, there were just, I worked with architects, landscape architects, I worked with um, engineers, I worked with construction companies, I worked with the Army Corps of Engineers.
Mhm.
And so there were a lot of you wind up having to collaborate with a lot of people because when you don't have certain skills, you
Mhm.
need other people who have
Yeah,
them.
for
And
sure.
museums don't always have people like that because these are one-off projects, or
Mhm.
and you need people who have specific kinds of expertise that, when I come up with my crazy idea with an artist who I select to create a park within a park, for example, I don't know, like, what I'm gonna need in order to make that thing happen.
Mhm.
So, I had a project manager for that, and then the project manager started troubleshooting and figuring out, like, okay, here's the idea. How exactly do we do this? And then he would bring me in at certain points to work with people or to give feedback on things. So you work with a lot of different kinds of people in different professions. And again, in some museums, probably not a ton.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
kind of place that I was in and the role that I played there, which was a pretty large role, led me to to have my hands in a lot of things. And
Yeah.
so I really had a lot of different types of experiences. I
Yeah.
spent 5 years working on it. We moved
Mhm.
here in 2011, and I left
Mhm.
the job in 2018.
Mhm.
And it was an exhausting experience.
I'm sure.
It was building a new contemporary art institution at an underfunded public university in the South with
Mhm.
architect. And so it had like every potential challenge associated with, and I didn't really know coming into it how much of a challenge it was. I sort of was feeling like I did the Venice Biennale. I did a
Mhm.
100-acre sculpture park with a building. I did a boutique art hotel. Like, I can do this. And I did do it. But when I started, I was the only person there. And I
Mhm.
had like a small office, and I just had to figure out how to do everything. And um, it was challenging
Mhm.
because the university didn't have a good handle on how a contemporary art institution really fit in with the
Mhm.
educational mission of the
Mhm.
university, which was unfortunate because we have one of the best public schools of art and design in the United States,
Yeah.
and most universities have art museums. But there was, VC is very young. It
Mhm.
really only, came about as a full university in around 1970.
Mhm.
So compared to the other colleges and universities in Virginia, it's like a baby
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah. So um, it was when I came into it, $10 million had been raised, and we needed to raise $37 million. And so the rest of that fell on me. And then I had to build an initial team of people. The first person I
Mhm.
hired um, was sort of someone was a development person who could help come up with a development plan. And then someone who was sort of like my chief of staff who could help organize things, and an administrative assistant. And little by little, I built sort of an operational plan for a
Mhm.
work plan for leading up to the opening. And we so we gradually developed a staff, and sort of figuring out what was necessary for the inside of the museum, starting to develop programs. And
Mhm.
so um, you know, we eventually moved to a satellite space because they
Mhm.
hadn't anticipated like that we would need a staff, or the size of the staff. And so everything that I did, I had to make a really strong case for, and nothing came easy. It was like, and sometimes it was like the same presentation over and over and over
Yeah.
again, constantly having to make a case for the budget that we needed, the
Mhm.
operational budget that we would need for the opening year, et cetera, working with, an architect who was very, very famous internationally. And, the donors had really, worked with a small team of university staff who they picked out the the architect before they had the director in place. And
Mhm.
so they didn't, the people who were on the team, identifying the architect and seeing what the building program plan was in terms of what was necessary inside of the building for it to function. None of them had ever worked in a museum before. And so when I came into the position, it was already at the design development, at construction documents, and sort of in the process of building
Mhm.
a building. You have conceptual plans, which are like the
Mhm.
big ideas, but
Mhm.
nothing about the feasibility. And then you go into design development, where you're starting to develop what the design is,
Mhm.
and then you start to figure out, given the budget that there is, how it can be done. It never can be done when it never can be done in the budget that you have. And then there are all of these trade-offs that you deal with lots of constituents, including the architects who have strong opinions about what they want.
Mhm.
And then eventually, once you all come to agreement, you go into the stamped construction drawings, which is when they start building. So they were at design development, the end of design development when I came in. And actually, for my second interview, I made a big deal about getting copies of the construction documents. It took a while, but I finally got them. I'm sorry that my camera is so bad
Oh
and this
no,
is fuzzy. I don't know why it's doing that.
it's okay.
Um, anyway, it was during that process that I was like, you don't have any area for the storage of incoming or outgoing crates of art. You don't have enough space for staff to work in, because they just thought that there would be 10 people working in the museum, but that was
Mhm.
based on nothing. It was just like
Wow.
pie in the sky. So, I think that once I came up with um, the model, and it was benchmarked with all non-collecting contemporary institutions that were not at like very well endowed private universities. I came up with sort of a halfway point for the operating budget that looked at the size of the building, the size of the galleries, how large the staff was, whether or
Mhm.
not they had a cafe, whether or not they had a shop, all of these different
Mhm.
factors, and then figuring out what did it take for them to operate? Like, how much was their operating budget? Was it sufficient? Was it insufficient? And then I was able to sort of make a case for
Mhm.
the university. Well, if we're going to be doing all of these things, we're going to need a staff of about this size. We're going to need an
Mm.
operating budget of about this size. And it was 3 times more than they had anticipated, but that was still lower than what most places were having. But it was like, there was a lot of that kind of, having to make a case for things and trying to convince people of what was necessary. At the same time, I had to raise $17 million with my
Yeah.
team, and the two
That's
big donors had already been identified.
mhm.
So a huge part of my job was fundraising because it had to get paid for.
Yeah.
And the university was not putting in much money,
Yeah.
and the state didn't put in any money. So it was a lot of pressure, and it really kind of ate me alive, to tell you the truth. And
Mhm.
it wasn't a good experience for me, in many
Mm.
different
Mhm.
ways. And um, went back to teaching like 5 years
Yeah.
ago, and I'm much happier. And I do curatorial projects on the side with other
Mhm.
institutions, and I do consulting, I've done consulting for different universities for their museums or for building projects. And um, at this point in my life, it's a pretty good balance. And
Mhm.
um, I can certainly say now, with what's going on with this administration, and their attitudes about cutting budgets, and the president just removing the chair of the Kennedy Center and firing the board. I
Yeah.
sort of expect that he's going to take over the Smithsonian museums shortly,
Mm. Mhm.
um, and places that have federal funding, their funding is being cut, and
Yeah.
there's a trickle down effect in the states. All of that is to say, to me right now, even though academia doesn't necessarily feel like a safe place either, it feels
Mhm.
safer to me. And like I know it better than going back into a museum position, because I think museums are in a lot of trouble right now.
Yeah. For
And
sure.
it's you know, hopefully that won't be forever. I don't think it's just the ICA. I think it's
Yeah.
been a gradual transformation.
Mhm.
When I was here in 2011, they were still flying Confederate flags at the
Yeah.
VMF. Um,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
and the
Yeah.
monuments were everywhere,
Mhm.
and everyone was always talking about, you know, historic Richmond and the Old
Mhm.
South and the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War was like every other word.
Mhm.
And I just believed that it was going to change. I knew that the ICA was part of that change. I didn't,
Mhm.
certainly didn't think it was the only part of it. There were already galleries in town. Eventually Quirk opened, that Katie Crop owned,
Mhm.
and she sold it, I think in the last year or so. That had, it was a boutique art hotel. It
Mhm.
still is. All of the amazing restaurants, they just kept growing as, people from Brooklyn and New York and other cities realized, hey, I can come down and buy a building and have my
Yeah.
own restaurant, and it's a lot better life than trying to make this work in New York or wherever,
Mhm.
brewery scene and the music scene. And so it just all kept growing. And I think now
Yeah.
we're at a point where a lot of people know about it.
Mhm.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's a small city, relatively speaking. So I think it's pushing above its weight
Mhm.
in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. It, I think for me personally, Virginia Rep could be doing a lot more innovative programming.
Yeah.
Mm, Altria could be taking a lot more chances. It feels to me like, it's pretty expected. There's nothing too excited. They repeat programs,
Mhm.
It feels to me like they could, bring in someone who will really like turn that up.
Mhm.
Um, there's a new director at Virginia Rep, so I'm
Okay.
excited to see what's going to happen there. You have
Yeah.
Triangle Theaters, Firehouse Theater. I'm not sure if
Yeah.
is still exists because it was going through some problems as well. Richmond Ballet,
Yeah.
I think
Oh.
a really critical place that doesn't always get discussed is the Maudlin Center at U of
Mhm.
R, and they have extraordinary programming. So
Mhm.
I think that even though they're a little bit off, they're not like in the exact center of the city. I think they do some of um the most exciting programs in all of the city, and that's music, dance, performance, theater, it's everything. And so that's really terrific. And then VCU is building a new performing arts center on the corner of Belvedere and Broad, and I think that that too is I don't know anything about the plans. I know a lot of it is for the performing arts school, whether or not they're going to open that up to other professional programming. I don't know, but I would hope so. And I think it could form a really nice counterpart with the ICA. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so I
Yeah.
think, and I also think the VMFA has, in the 10 years or plus that I've been here, they've really transformed um, in terms of everything. They're much
Mhm.
more open, dynamic. The person who's come in and who's the chief curator has transformed the curatorial department. And there have been a lot of self-organized shows instead of um, touring exhibitions that they take from other institutions. So I think the VMFA has gotten really exciting. I think the Virginia Museum of History and Culture has turned
Mhm.
around from this kind
Yeah.
of mausoleum to
Mhm.
a really interesting
Mhm.
space that thinks about the complexity and depth and diversity of history and
Yeah.
culture. I was just there on Monday, and it's really mind-blowing. They're doing
Mhm.
really great work. So, I think it takes a village, and there are a
For
lot
sure.
of people here now who are, a lot of people who are doing fantastic work. And um, I think it's come a long way.
Mhm.
I think yeah, I think it's in a
Yeah.
really good situation. I just think it's going to keep getting better.
Interesting.
That was really part of the planning for it from the
Mhm.
very beginning, the idea that it would be integrated throughout the university and do collaborative projects if professors wanted to. And so even when we were in the process of building the institution and there was no physical place yet, we started collaborating with different departments. We were collaborating with the library, with interior design. We worked with the business school for their MBA program. They do a strategic dilemma project, and they got to use the ICA and me as part of the project. I think that there's been a big change over the last 20 years in university art museums, from being more isolated, sort of mini museums or museums on their own, to recognizing the importance of being connected to the rest of the university for students, faculty, staff, as well as the broader community.
Mhm.
And some of that came out of a very particular situation. I don't know if you ever heard of Bernie Madoff, but he was sort of a finance guy,
Mm.
who managed the finances of a lot of wealthy people.
Mm.
And he was involved in creating a huge Ponzi scheme. And these
Mm.
people lost everything. And a lot of these people were affiliated with major universities,
Mhm.
museums, etc. They were the big donors.
Mhm.
So Brandeis University has a museum called the RVArt Museum,
Mhm.
and it has one of the finest collections of modern and contemporary art in New England. And what happened was, at that time, when universities were suddenly like without massive amounts of money, they were wanting to leverage their museum collections and sell the artwork. And part
Mhm.
of that was because um, they didn't understand first that they couldn't really do that,
Mhm.
in terms of accreditation, or in terms of, legal reasons for the gifts and
Yeah.
etc. But they also didn't realize the value of it for the university
Yeah.
and for the students. And
Mm.
so once that happened, the Mellon Foundation came out with a study and a program that they funded that was helping universities and art museums come together and work together, and so that they were integrated.
Mhm.
And so because of that funding and the program that the Mellon Foundation created, university art museums became a lot more aware of sort of what they needed to do to be interconnected to the universities and the colleges at large, in order for other people to see the value in them. Like,
Mhm.
you know, and so, best practices definitely suggested that, we should do that as well. And it was also very clear from the lack of understanding about, you know,
Yeah.
um, certain people believing that, the ICA was a pet donor project, which I heard repeatedly,
Mm.
to understanding how it was completely mission related to
Yeah.
education, from many different
Mhm.
departments. Getting as much as you experience you can in college,
Mhm.
with internships in different areas. For artists, I think artists who are in school should be in undergraduate should be learning as much as they possibly can and really pushing themselves. If they really think that they want to go on and become professional artists, they can go to grad school, but they shouldn't take on big loans. I also think that probably 90-95% of students in art programs are not going to go on to be professional artists. It's
Mhm.
very hard to be,
Yeah.
very, very hard. And so I think that, um, you know, it's important, if you're interested in art, learning about different opportunities that there are um, in the art world as professions. And there are a lot of them. And on my professional practices class, I teach about that quite a bit. And so um, I think that uh, it's important to be educated and educate yourself and really think about what kind of a life you want.
Yeah.
And that gets back to sort of deciding what's important to you in terms of where you live, how much money you make,
Mhm.
how often you see your family, what the nature of your work is. Do you bring it home with you, or, do you leave it behind? There are a lot of things. So I think it's often helpful, if you can, to think through what it would mean um, to have a career in a certain area. And if you don't know the answer to that, find out. And what I mean by that is
Mhm.
do informational interviews with people, ask if you can shadow people. There are a lot of things that you can do when you're an undergraduate, and people for the most part are pretty generous. So, you know, um, I think, just educating yourself as much as possible is
Yeah.
very important.